Hello class, and welcome to your Chapter 8 lecture, where we're going to start discussing juveniles being sentenced in adult court and the differences between adult and juveniles when it comes to culpability. So our learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end, you should be able to explain the differences in maturity between juveniles and adults, explain how transfers to adult court take place, as well as the different types of waivers. You should be able to explain how the youthful offender system works, summarize the debate about juveniles receiving a life sentence without parole, and discuss the death penalty for juveniles. So our first question to ask is children or adults? So juvenile court should maintain jurisdiction over youth until their deficiencies are corrected or they have developed the mental and emotional maturity of adults. The problem, however, is maturity refers to when a person responds appropriately to circumstances and their environment. And the question is, at what point is that? Who makes that determination? There are some adults who still don't appropriately respond to their circumstances. Juveniles also have a diminished moral, cognitive, and social development when you compare them to adults. This is equal now to having a diminished responsibility. So juveniles in the juvenile justice system often have emotional problems and learning disabilities. We also know that youth under 15 years of age manifest levels of impairment equal to their adult counterparts who are deemed incompetent to stand trial. So if that's the case, how then do we transfer juveniles to the adult system for sentencing? So looking at transfer to the adult court, juveniles transferred to adult court are actually going to be tried and punished as adults and can be sent to adult prisons. So more than 200,000 youth are transferred and prosecuted in the U.S. every year. However, based on 2019 estimates, this is now around 53,000. And that's based on estimates by the National Center for Juvenile Justice. So this is down 80% from the 1990s and even 30% from 2015. There are three types of transfer. You have judicial waiver, prosecutorial discretion, and statutory exclusion, which we'll go through each of them. Now, only 11 states provided data on statutory exclusion and prosecutorial discretion, and the other 24 states had to be estimated for the number of cases that are transferred each year in the U.S., so we never have a complete full picture of how many youth are being transferred. Now, let's talk about judicial waiver. This is where the judge is going to make a determination of whether or not the case should be transferred to adult court or whether the case should be retained in juvenile court for processing and sentencing. And this is the most widely used method of transfer. The judge is going to take into account factors such as the age of the juvenile and their maturity. They'll look at the relationship with their parents and their school performance or behavior. They'll look at the relationships they have with their community and their behavior in the community, as well as their level of risk and how amenable that juvenile is to services within the juvenile system and juvenile court. So a lot of the same factors that we look at when we address the needs of juveniles in juvenile court. Prosecutorial discretion, then, is when the prosecutor makes the decision of whether or not to file the case in adult or juvenile court. The question becomes, though, that prosecutors also determine which charges to bring forth against the juvenile. So do they have too much power in this case? So while the police file alleged charges, the prosecutor is ultimately the one at the end of the day who decides which charges go forth. So they can amend charges, they can add, they can subtract. So if they have this ability, then what's to say that they couldn't add a charge or increase a charge that would then make that juvenile eligible to have their case transferred to the adult court? We then have statutory exclusion. This says that certain offenses are actually excluded from being tried in juvenile court. So there are certain offenses where statute says anyone who commits this offense cannot be tried in juvenile court. They have to be tried in the adult court. So, or the age of juvenile court jurisdiction is actually lower than 18 years of age. So there are very few states now that actually have the age of juvenile court jurisdiction under 18 because of the Raise the Age campaign, which really went across the country, and they made a lot of legislative changes to raise that minimum age of juvenile court jurisdiction as well as the maximum age. So minimum age of juvenile court jurisdiction refers to the minimum age that a juvenile can be to even be tried in juvenile court, to even be considered a delinquent. So in Pennsylvania, any juvenile less than the age of 10 can't be tried for crimes that they commit. The maximum age of juvenile court jurisdiction is then going to be the highest age that a juvenile can be once they've entered the juvenile justice system until their case has to be closed out. So in Pennsylvania, that age is 21. So if you get on, as long as you commit your crime before the age of 18, and so if you commit the crime before the age of 18, that's the sort of maximum age of court jurisdiction to be able to charge a juvenile in juvenile court. You can remain on supervision and in services until the age of 21, which is great because it allows juveniles who maybe just squeak in there before they were 18 to still have those services available to them. So for example, New York actually raised their minimum age from 7 to 12. So that means that no longer can 7 through 11-year-olds be tried for offenses in juvenile court. They have to be 12. And they actually raised their maximum age from 15 to 17. So previously in New York, any juvenile who was 16 years of age or older was considered criminally responsible, that of an adult. So they automatically would have been tried in adult court. So that's been raised to 17. Now, reverse waiver and blended sentencing also have to be discussed because these are options to sort of keep the juvenile within juvenile court to some degree. So a reverse waiver, or decertification is what we call it in Pennsylvania, it allows a youth who's over the age to be sent back to juvenile court for processing. Decertification we have in Pennsylvania allows when a juvenile is sent to the adult court, they can petition to have their case sent back down to juvenile court if they show that their case is better served in the juvenile court. Blended sentencing then is the juvenile being given a juvenile and an adult sentence that works in one of two ways. So either the youth serves their juvenile sentence, and then if they violate or fail to comply, then that adult sentence kicks in. Or the youth has to serve the juvenile sentence until they reach that age of majority, and then they'll complete their adult sentence with the time served for that juvenile sentence. So it can work one of two ways. Sort of blending the two worlds together and recognizing that juveniles still need juvenile-specific programming, which just is not available in the adult world. There's barely programs or sufficient programs available in the adult court that they certainly don't have the funds, the means, and the staffing to be able to now offer programs for juveniles as well. So what are some criteria for the courts that they have to consider when they're determining whether or not to waive a case to the adult court? They take into account the seriousness of the alleged offense, whether it was aggressive, violent, or premeditated, or simply just willful in nature. They'll consider whether it was a property or person offenses because both can be transferred, as well as drug crimes. Is there evidence that a grand jury would return an indictment? So is it believed that if they took all of this evidence to a grand jury, they would say, yes, in fact, there's enough evidence here to bring these charges forth? The desirability to hold one trial in adult court, if there's a co-defendant and that co-defendant is an adult, it may make more sense to try the juvenile as an adult because you can have one hearing instead of having to have two hearings in two different courts. How sophisticated or mature is the juvenile? Is there a prior criminal history or record of that juvenile? And is there adequate protection of the public and likelihood of rehabilitation of the youth if the youth would remain in the juvenile justice system? So all of these factors are taken into account. Whether it's the judge taking it into account or whether it's the prosecutor taking it into account. Again, if we consider statutory exclusion, there's no other factors being taken into account. It is simply whatever that legislation says, whatever the statute says. So a waiver or transfer hearing, the prosecutor here would file a motion, and then a probable cause hearing is held. And here's where the judge is going to make a determination if there's probable cause and they're going to consider the following. Is a juvenile a risk to the safety of their self or others? Again, the juvenile sophistication and maturity, amenability to treatment, history of violent crimes. Maybe the juvenile had childhood trauma or is associated with a gang. And is there any premeditation of the offense? Decertification, which I briefly mentioned earlier, is now the sending of a case back to juvenile court for prosecution if the court determines, after listening and considering all of these factors, again, if it's best to serve them in juvenile court rather than the adult court. But the burden of proof is on the juvenile to prove that. So considering the success of actually waiving juveniles to adult court, it's not always the most serious or violent offenders who are waived, though I will say because of the Raise the Age campaign, over the years we have been doing a much better job of only sentencing the most serious youth to the adult court, which typically you're going to think about are juveniles who have committed murder. But they can be sent to the adult court for drug offenses and for property offenses. Interestingly, drug and property offenses are actually more likely to be waived than violent crimes, and that includes felony drug possession and distribution, and then violent or felony property offenses. So robbery, for example, or burglary. Waiver does not deter youth from crime, but actually increases it. So sending a juvenile to the adult court, what they actually find is that in all of the research, juveniles who are first-time offenders and who are sent to adult court actually have low recidivism rates, but juveniles who have had a history, who are not first-time offenders, it does increase their likelihood to offend. And what that tells you is a first-time offender who's sent to adult court typically was not at risk for reoffending again anyway. So was it really necessary in that case then to transfer them to the adult system? So transferred youth are more likely to offend. They have a greater likelihood of being rearrested, and they also show an increased rates of recidivism. So not a lot of positive outcomes. So what we have are youthful offender systems for youth who are sentenced in adult court. So they can be placed on probation, they can be ordered fines and restitution, having their case dismissed, being released to parents, or sometimes even being placed in juvenile facilities until they reach the age of 18, and then typically they would go into an adult facility. Or they have adult facilities where they are separated by sight and sound until they turn 18, and then they can move over onto the adult side. So the youthful offender system really provides or attempts to provide programs in these institutional settings that are now more so going to focus on job readiness, training and experiences that are going to enhance the self-esteem of the youth and establish ties to the community for a successful reintegration. So again, it's not so much focusing then on those mental health, substance abuse necessarily needs. We're focusing now on how do we help you be a successful adult out in the world? Because the idea is that these are, for all intents and purposes, mentally they're thinking like an adult. Considering now life in prison for a juvenile, what does it look like? Well, for a juvenile in prison, they're really austere. It's very severe, it's strict, it's harsh, they're crowded, they're dangerous. Juveniles are going to experience higher rates of physical and sexual victimization and assault when they're placed in prisons. Their mental health is exacerbated, their suicidal ideations are exacerbated, and now they're going to receive fewer age-appropriate services like I mentioned. In addition, youth are highly impressionable, right? So they're easily manipulated by that gang culture to sort of join in, and that iatrogenic effect I mentioned before. Now these youth are learning even more sophisticated crimes. They're learning even more criminal behaviors from the adults that they're incarcerated with. So there's a few Supreme Court decisions regarding the death penalty for juveniles that are important to talk about. So when we talk about Gregg v. Georgia, the very first one in 76, the death penalty was ruled that the death penalty did not violate cruel and unusual punishment as it relates to the 8th Amendment. Though it did say that age and circumstance of crime had to be considered in that decision. We then, a few years later, had the determination that chronological age of the juvenile had to be a mitigating factor and should be given really great weight in determining whether or not to give them the death penalty. So chronological age, their actual biological age, not maturity level or age at which their IQ or emotional intelligence, their chronological age really had to be taken into account. Thompson v. Oklahoma said that the 8th and 14th Amendments prohibit the execution of a person who is 16 years or younger at the time of the offense. So if someone commits an offense at the age of 16, they then could not be given the death penalty. But at 17, you could. So then the minimum age for the death penalty was officially set at 16 in Stanford v. Kentucky. Atkins v. Virginia then said that juveniles who were deemed, and this was the terminology at the time, mentally retarded, could not be executed. So no matter what their chronological age was, if they were deemed clinically mentally retarded, they could not be executed. And it took us all the way until 2005 in Roper v. Simmons to have the minimum age for the death penalty set at 18. And it was finally deemed that the death penalty for youth is unconstitutional. The last execution of a juvenile offender was in 2003. So he was 36 years of age at the time of his execution. His name was Scott Allen Hain, and he was 17 years old at the time he was convicted for his crime. So 2003, that's 22 years ago. It is wild to think that we were still allowing the death penalty for individuals who committed a crime, in my opinion, who committed a crime before the age of 18, when we know what we know about brain development in juveniles, that they really have a diminished responsibility and diminished capacity to understand the long-term consequences of their behaviors. And just some Supreme Court decisions now regarding life without parole for juvenile offenders. So Graham v. Florida in 2010 said that, so LWOP is life without parole, for any juvenile who did not commit homicide was unconstitutional. So juveniles could not be given life without parole anymore if it was not a homicide case. In Miller v. Alabama, juveniles could not be sentenced to mandatory life without parole. They said that the judge had to make a separate determination that that juvenile was permanently incorrigible. And remember, we've been talking about incorrigibility as just being that there is really no hope for this juvenile. No amount of services would help this juvenile in redeeming themselves and being rehabilitated. You're essentially saying there's no hope. So it's saying that a juvenile could not be sentenced to mandatory life without parole because there are certain offenses where life without parole is mandatory on that case, legislatively. And then Montgomery v. Louisiana in 2016 actually retroactively applied to Miller v. Alabama in 2012, which led to a lot of juveniles needing to be resentenced who had been given that mandatory life without parole sentence previously. So I will say a fair amount of those juveniles were released, but some of them were resentenced to life without parole. And then you have Jones v. Mississippi in 2021, which said that the judge does not have to make a separate factual finding of permanent incorrigibility before sentencing that juvenile to life without parole. So again, you look at Miller v. Alabama and it says, well, the judge has to make a determination of permanent incorrigibility. And what Jones v. Mississippi said was that the judge doesn't have to make a separate factual finding. So it doesn't have to be a separate hearing. It can be all within the same hearing that the judge is looking at all of these facts and makes that determination. So in sum, juveniles are cognitively, emotionally, and developmentally different from adults. There are three main types of transfer. You have judicial waiver, prosecutorial discretion, and statutory exclusion. Blended sentencing allows a youth to be given a juvenile and an adult sentence concurrently. And we do have intermediate correctional systems for youth, which are going to focus on job readiness, training, and experience. The death penalty is now unconstitutional for youth under the age of 18. And life without parole is unconstitutional for non-homicidal cases. Moreover, it is unconstitutional to sentence a juvenile to mandatory life without parole. The judge has to make a factual finding that the juvenile is permanently incorrigible in order to sentence them to life without parole. So this was your Chapter 8 lecture on juveniles in the adult court system and transfer to the adult system. I hope everyone has a fabulous week.